meet y'all.
So a lot of people have an intuitive understanding what colorblind racism is. You know, you hang around white people all day, you see them Get Out, so you know the interpersonal part of it. And even the Oscars thinks they have like a pretty good understanding of colorblind racism because they nominated for Best Picture. But I think what's going on here is a lot more ideological and a lot more structural based than simply interpersonal relationships. So to do that, can you put up clip number 1? To do that, I'm going to use Eduardo Bonilla Silva's definition of colorblind racism, which he outlined it in the book Racism Without Racists. And now the way Eduardo defines it is through 4 terms. He uses the idea that whites use abstract liberalism, they use naturalization, they use cultural racism, and they minimize the racial impact on today's society to explain why blacks are in the second-class position, which is completely different than what was during the 60s and even before then, which is biological and genetics. So Eduardo he went around to a Midwestern university, Southern University, and a Northeastern University. He didn't name them, so don't put anyone on blast. But through that, he found that these whites actually followed the 4 sort of frames of explaining racism that he outlined before he even done the survey. So the first and most important part of it is the abstract liberalism. This is the sort of thing you get when you tell something that's happening racial in the country and you propose an explicitly racial solution, but then a white person says, you can't force the government to do that. That just doesn't make any sense. You can't force me to accommodate black people. That's just my right. I don't have to accommodate black people. See, the thing about this is that first of all, it doesn't understand the governmental functions that blacks place on, so that the government is placed on blacks' life. When you have police brutality, you have mass incarceration, you have generational wealth gaps that the government is seemingly ignoring, it seems sort of odd to say the government caused these problems, but the government shouldn't be able to fix these problems because that doesn't make any sense. It's rhetorical incoherence. And the other part of it is that it obscures the way that the government has already caused these problems as well. It also allows whites to distance themselves from the racial differences while also appearing some more moral or intelligent way. So when someone says, well, the government shouldn't do that because of some obscure rights, you notice that they'll never alienate or exactly say what these rights are and what rights they're supposing infringing when they're forced to, I don't know, send their kids to actually integrated school as opposed like an IB school where over 90% of the kids are white. Another part of the abstract liberalism is that it contains a choice component, which has been carried over from the feminist discourse of around the same days of the 60s and 70s. Now, this choice discourse works in a way sort of similar to what we were talking about before about government choice, or governmental not being allowed to do certain actions that benefit the black community. But the way the choice discourse works is that it simply just says, I have a right to choose where my child goes and what happens when my child is interacting with black children. And
I have a right to choose to avoid Negroes.
Exactly.
Don't tell me I have to send I don't want to live around them. I don't want to send my kid to school around them. That's not my problem. And you got to respect my right to choose.
Yeah, it's especially prominent during like primary education, during elementary and middle school, where you'll find that just like the white mothers of before in the generation past just have this, they don't know it. They don't know it. Of course, they wouldn't know it. But they don't know. They have this sort of view of black people as sort of a corrupting influence, and the way that they interact with white children seems to be able to, I don't know, lessen their children as somehow it's like decreasing their abilities for capacity. Which leads me to Eduardo's second point of colorblind racism, which is cultural racism. Cultural racism is essentially whenever you hear the term a welfare baby or a welfare queen. It has a lot to do with like the biological and genetics of the Jim Crow racism, but this time they just decide, well, maybe blacks don't have bad genes, they just have a bad culture. You know, hip hop. What's the deal with hip hop? That doesn't make any sense to me. It's just bad culture. So this is how people sort of justify not sending their kids to a black school or making good decisions for black people. They just wouldn't. When they say that they want to make a decision for black people, they already have the assumption that when you make that decision, the blacks won't benefit from it because they already have a bad culture, and that's what makes it different from Jim Crow racism, which is purely biological or genetic based. And that also brings me to the third way Eduardo outlines it, which he uses the naturalization. Naturalization sort of works best when it's in tandem with cultural racism, because you can say, well, blacks just have a different way of viewing the world. They have a different culture, and whites just have a different way of viewing the world and a different culture. So I think it's just best if we just naturally just associate people like with us. I mean, I don't know any black people who like Twin Peaks. I want to hang around people who like Twin Peaks. I don't want to hang around people who don't watch Twin Peaks. And that's how they view it. They just view segregation as sort of a natural thing. People just naturally associate with them, with people like them. And that certainly has a psychological basis. You sort of attract people who are like you, but that doesn't justify implementing it and justifying it on a governmental level. When you say that segregation is just sort of something that naturally happens, you ignore the entire history throughout America that has caused segregation on an intentional and institutional level. When you say it's just something naturally, it's just not correct. And finally, that brings me to the last way Walter outlines it, and he says that whites almost always display a minimization of racism in society. So this is that one white friend you have who somehow just doesn't get racism at all. He just says racism that was a 60s thing. You know, we don't lynch black people anymore, which we'll get into. We have a different way of lynching them now. But we just don't lynch black people anymore. We don't have the same discrimination. There's no legal code that says black people can't do this. I mean, that's a fair point. There is no legal code that black people can't do this in most cases, but it ignores how these structures have been, again, implemented to degrade black people and put them in a second-class position. This is why that you have the generational effect of Jim Crow and slavery on families. Even if somehow we're completely to get rid of all the institutional structures that are limiting black people, it would still require successive generations of repeatedly doing the right thing to generate a black class that is on the same level with the white class right now.